The James family had once been a happy and comfortable home. Mr. James, a hard-working and loving father, provided for his family with all his strength. His 3 daughters, Mirabelle, Fortune and Blessing, were his pride, and he had big dreams for them. He made sure they went to school, had food on the table, and never lacked anything. Their mother, Mrs. James, did not work, but she managed the home while her husband took care of everything else. But life had a cruel way of changing things. Mr. James fell ill suddenly. At first it was just a fever, then weakness, then he could not get out of bed. The family tried everything: hospital visits, prayers and traditional medicine, but nothing worked. Within weeks, the man who had once been full of life was now a shadow of himself. His daughters watched in fear as he grew weaker every day. Then one evening Mr. James called his daughters to his bedside. His voice was faint, but his love for them was strong. "My beautiful girls," he whispered, "be strong. Take care of each other. And no matter what happens, do not lose yourselves." Tears ran down their faces. Mirabelle, the eldest at 24, held his hand tightly. "Daddy, don't say that. You will be fine," she said, her voice shaking. But he only smiled weakly. And that night Mr. James closed his eyes for the last time. The house was filled with wailing the next morning. Mrs. James fell to the floor in sorrow. The girls felt like their world had ended. How would they survive without their father? Who would take care of them now? After the burial, things changed. Mr. James had been the only one working, and now there was no money coming in. The little savings he left was quickly used up: house rent, school fees, food. The burden was too much. Mirabelle was the first to get a job, but the pay was barely enough for herself, let alone the entire family. Fortune and Blessing also tried to find work, but jobs were hard to come by. Days turned into weeks, and they often went to bed hungry. Mrs. James, who had once been a loving mother, became frustrated. She would sit in the small living room, her face hard with worry, snapping at her daughters over little things. One night, after another day of searching for jobs with no success, the girls returned home tired and disappointed. Their mother was waiting for them. "You girls have been looking for jobs for how long now? And still nothing?" she asked, her arms crossed. "Mama, we are trying," Fortune said, almost in tears. "Nobody is hiring. And even when they do, they pay so little." Mrs. James scoffed. Trying does not put food on the table. Do you think suffering is fun? Look at me, I am getting old. I cannot keep living like this." "Mama, what do you want us to do?" Mirabelle asked, exhausted. Their mother looked at them, then sighed deeply. "Do what other girls are doing." The room went silent. "What do you mean, Mama?" Blessing asked slowly. Their mother stood up, her eyes sharp. "Are you all children? Don't you see how other girls live? How do you think they afford the good life? A woman must use what she has to get what she wants." The sisters stared at her in shock. Was their mother really saying what they thought she was saying? "No, Mama," Mirabelle said firmly. "We will not do that." Mrs. James laughed coldly. "Then go and find money. Because if you don't, I will send you all away." Tears burned in their eyes. Was this really their mother? The woman who had raised them? That night the sisters lay on the hard floor, unable to sleep. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs. Fear weighed on their hearts. Mirabelle whispered, "We have to find a way. If not, Mama will really throw us out." "But what can we do?" Fortune asked weakly. None of them had an answer. The next morning their mother did not speak to them. She acted as if they did not exist. When they tried to talk to her, she ignored them. Days passed and the tension in the house grew. Then one evening their mother spoke again. "This is my last warning," she said coldly. "If you girls cannot bring money into this house, then you are no longer my daughters." They had no choice. With heavy hearts and broken spirits, they stepped into a dark world they never imagined they would enter. Mirabelle, Fortune, and Blessing stood in the middle of their small room, their hearts heavy with fear and shame. Their mother's words echoed in their minds. "If you girls cannot bring money into this house, then you are no longer my daughters." They had tried everything, looking for jobs, asking friends for help, but nothing worked. Hunger and desperation clouded their judgment. That night as they lay awake, Mirabelle finally spoke. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered. Fortune and Blessing turned to look at her. "I don't want to live like this, begging, starving, feeling like I don't belong in my own home," she continued. "Maybe Mama is right. Maybe this is the only way." No, Mirabelle, Blessing said, her voice shaking. We can find another way. Like what? Mirabelle snapped, her frustration spilling out. Tell me, Blessing. What way? Blessing had no answer. Fortune remained silent, staring at the ceiling. The next evening they dressed up and left the house. Their mother watched them go without a word. They stood by the roadside, their hearts pounding. Cars passed by, people walked past, but they felt like the entire world was staring at them, judging them. Just when they were about to change their minds, a black SUV pulled up. The tinted window rolled down, revealing a man in a dark suit. How much? He asked casually, as if he was asking for the price of bread. Mirabelle's heart dropped. She felt sick. But she reminded herself why they were here. Survival. She forced a smile, named a price, and the man nodded. That was the beginning. At first they hated it. Every night after returning home, they scrubbed their skin as if trying to wash away the shame. But soon the money started coming in. They could afford food. They could buy new clothes. They even gave their mother money, hoping it would make her happy. And it did. Mrs. James changed overnight. She began smiling again, cooking their favorite meals, treating them like her beloved daughters once more. She no longer complained or ignored them. Instead, she praised them. This is what I call smart girls, she would say. Look at how your lives have changed. But deep inside, the girls knew they had lost something. Their innocence. Their self-respect. As time passed, what once made them feel guilty became normal. The shame faded. The pain dulled. Soon they moved into a new apartment. A beautiful one with soft couches, air conditioning, and a large TV. They no longer had to struggle for anything. Their mother was proud of them, but not everyone approved. One afternoon, Mrs. James' childhood friend, Auntie Grace, came to visit. She had heard rumors and wanted to confirm them. "Ah, my sister, I see your daughters are doing well," Auntie Grace said as she sat in the living room. Mrs. James smiled proudly. "Yes, oh, my daughters are now big girls. They take care of me like queens." Auntie Grace's face darkened. "But how are they making money?" Mrs. James waved her hand dismissively. "They have found a way. You know life is not easy." Auntie Grace leaned forward, lowering her voice. "I know what they are doing. And I know it is wrong." Mrs. James' smile faded. "Grace, please don't start." "But I must start." Auntie Grace said, her voice firm. "You are their mother. You should protect them, not push them into danger." Mrs. James' face hardened. "Danger? Which danger? Look at them. They are no longer suffering. I don't care what anyone says, my daughters will not die in poverty like their father." Auntie Grace shook her head, sadness filling her eyes. "I hope you don't regret this." She stood up, picked up her handbag and walked out. Mrs. James sat in silence for a long time. But instead of feeling guilty, she became more determined. That evening, when the girls returned home, she gathered them around. "Listen to me," she said. "People will talk. They will try to make you feel guilty. Don't listen to them. We are surviving, and that is all that matters." The girls nodded. They had already decided that this was their life now. Weeks passed. Life was good. Until one fateful night. Mirabelle, Fortune, and Blessing were standing outside a nightclub when a group of well-dressed men approached them. They looked rich, confident, and powerful. One of them, a tall man with a gold watch, smiled at them. "We like you girls," he said smoothly. "Come with us. We will take care of you tonight." The amount they offered was more than anything they had ever been paid before. The girls hesitated for a moment, but the temptation was too strong. As they got into the car, something felt off. The men were whispering to each other, their eyes dark and unreadable. But the girls ignored their fears. Then the car turned onto an unfamiliar road. It was dark. Quiet. "Where are we going?" Mirabelle asked, her voice uneasy. The man with the gold watch smirked. "Don't worry. We're taking you somewhere special." Fortune's heart started pounding. "But this is not the usual way." The men didn't answer. Instead, they kept driving deeper into the darkness. Something was very, very wrong. The car sped through the dark, silent road. The once lively city lights were gone, replaced by thick trees and empty fields. The further they went, the more afraid Mirabelle, Fortune, and Blessing became. "This is not where we agreed to go," Fortune said, her voice shaking. The man with the gold watch turned and smiled. But there was no warmth in his eyes. "Relax, beautiful. We just want some privacy." Mirabelle's stomach tightened. She reached for the door handle but the child lock was on. The realization hit her like a slap. They were trapped. Blessing's breath quickened. "Please let us out," she begged. The men laughed. One of them pulled out a cigarette, lighting it casually. "You're not going anywhere," he said. The car drove deeper into the lonely road, the silence growing heavier. Then out of nowhere a large black gate appeared. It was old, rusty and covered in strange carvings. The driver honked twice and the gates creaked open slowly. Behind them the road disappeared as trees closed in, like they had just entered another world. Mirabelle's hands were shaking now. She grabbed Fortune's wrist, her heart hammering against her ribs. Something terrible was about to happen. The car stopped in front of a small, eerie-looking building. The men got out first, stretching like they had all the time in the world. "Get down," one of them ordered. Nobody moved. "I said get down." His voice was sharp, like a knife cutting through the night. The girls hesitated, but what choice did they have? Slowly they stepped out of the car. As soon as their feet touched the ground, strong hands grabbed them from behind. They screamed. They fought. But the men were too strong. "Shut up," one of them barked, slapping Mirabelle hard across the face. She gasped, pain exploding in her cheek. They were dragged inside the building. The air smelled of smoke, sweat and something else. Something rotten. Candles flickered against the walls, casting long, dancing shadows. At the center of the room was a wooden table covered in dark stains. Blessing's legs gave out and she collapsed, sobbing. "Please, don't kill us." The man with the gold watch knelt beside her, tilting her chin up with a cold smile. "Oh, sweetheart. We're not killing you." He leaned in, whispering into her ear. "The gods are." Terror gripped them as they realized where they were. This was a shrine. A place for human sacrifices. Skulls lined the shelves. Bloodstained knives rested on a wooden table. Hanging from the ceiling were strange charms, tied with red and black cloth. A man dressed in a red robe entered the room. His eyes were dark and empty, like a deep, bottomless pit. "They will do," he said, his voice raspy. "Tie them up. The sacrifice happens at dawn." Sacrifice. The word sent ice-cold fear through their veins. "No. Please. Let us go." Fortune screamed, struggling violently. But it was useless. They were shoved into a corner and bound with thick ropes. The men left, shutting the heavy door behind them. The room fell into darkness. For a long moment, the only sound was their breathing, shaky, uneven gasps of terror. "We are going to die," Blessing sobbed. "No," Mirabelle said, her voice filled with determination. "We are not." She struggled against the ropes but they were too tight. Her wrists burned from the friction. Fortune swallowed hard. "What if nobody finds us?" Mirabelle took a deep breath. "Then we find ourselves." Hours passed. The night stretched on, each second feeling like a lifetime. Outside they could hear voices, low chants, strange whispers. A drum began to beat softly. Dawn was approaching. Mirabelle knew they had little time. She turned to Fortune. "Try to untie me." Fortune twisted her body, working her fingers against Mirabelle's rope. It was rough but she kept pulling, ignoring the pain. Finally the knot loosened. Mirabelle yanked her hands free. Her skin was raw but she didn't care. She quickly untied Fortune, then Blessing. Their hearts pounded. Now they had to escape. Mirabelle crept toward the door and pressed her ear against it. The voices were farther now, distracted by the ritual preparations. Slowly she pushed the door. It didn't move. Blocked. Panic flared, but she forced herself to stay calm. She scanned the room. Then she saw it, a small window near the ceiling. It was tiny but it was their only hope. "Blessing, you go first," Mirabelle whispered. Blessing's hands trembled as she climbed onto Mirabelle's shoulders. She reached for the window and pushed. It opened. She squeezed through, her body scraping against the rough walls. Then she disappeared into the darkness outside. Fortune went next. Then Mirabelle. As soon as her feet touched the ground outside, she grabbed her sister's hands. They ran. They didn't look back. They ran through the trees, their bare feet bleeding from thorns and sharp rocks. The night air burned in their lungs. Behind them a shout rang out. "They've escaped." Footsteps thundered. The men were coming. Mirabelle pushed harder. "Faster," she gasped. Then up ahead headlights appeared. A car was coming down the lonely road. Mirabelle waved her arms, screaming, "Help! Please help us!" The car slowed down. The driver was an elderly man. His eyes widened as he saw their torn clothes, their terrified faces. "What happened to you?" he asked. "No time. Just drive." Mirabelle pleaded. He didn't ask any more questions. He opened the door and they jumped in. As the car sped off, they saw the ritualists emerge from the darkness. Their faces were twisted in rage. But it was too late. The girls were gone. The car didn't stop until they reached the police station. The girls stumbled inside, still breathless. The officers took one look at them and knew something was terribly wrong. They listened as the girls told their horrifying story. The old man, the driver, nodded. "I picked them up near an old shrine in the forest. I know that place." The officers exchanged glances. "This is not the first time girls have gone missing in that area," one of them muttered. That night, a team of officers, armed and ready, drove to the shrine. They surrounded the building, waiting in silence. Hours later, the ritualists returned, expecting to complete their sacrifice. Instead, they walked straight into a police ambush. They were caught. Every last one of them. The ritualists were caught like wild animals in a trap. As the police officers closed in on them, they tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The men in red robes, the same ones who had prepared to sacrifice Mirabelle, Fortune, and Blessing, were shoved to the ground and handcuffed. The officer in charge, a tall, serious man named Inspector Ken, stepped forward. "You are under arrest for kidnapping, attempted murder, and human sacrifice." One of the men, the one with the gold watch, smirked. "Do you think you have won?" he sneered. "You don't know the kind of power we serve." Inspector Ken didn't flinch. "Tell that to the judge." The police searched the shrine, uncovering horrifying evidence: bloody clothes, human skulls, and black charms hanging from the ceiling. The entire place reeked of evil. Mirabelle, Fortune, and Blessing watched from the police station as the news spread like wildfire. The officers took statements, collected evidence, and made sure that justice would be served. But even though the ritualists were caught, the sisters didn't feel safe. The memories of that night haunted them. When the police called Mrs. James, she rushed to the station. She had been worried sick after her daughters didn't return home, but deep down she never expected things to be this bad. The moment she saw her daughters, bruised, dirty, and trembling, she broke down in tears. "My children," she wailed, falling to her knees. "What have I done?" Mirabelle stared at her mother, emotions swirling inside her. She wanted to be angry. She wanted to scream at her for pushing them into this life. But at that moment she saw something she had never seen before in her mother's eyes: true regret. Mrs. James reached for their hands. "Forgive me, please," she sobbed. "I was blinded by money. I didn't know it would lead to this." Blessing wiped her own tears. "Mama, we almost died. I know, my daughter. And if anything had happened to you, I would never forgive myself." There was silence. Then Fortune spoke. "What now?" Mrs. James sniffed and held their hands tighter. "We leave that life behind. We find a new way to survive. Even if it takes time, even if it is hard, we will never go down that dark path again." For the first time in a long time, they felt like a real family again. The next few days were difficult. The girls had no source of income anymore and their savings wouldn't last forever. But this time they refused to go back. With the help of Auntie Grace, their mother's friend, Mirabelle got a job as a sales assistant in a boutique. It wasn't much, but it was enough to help. Fortune started learning how to sew, while Blessing began attending vocational training for catering. Their mother, Mrs. James, also decided to make a change. She started a small business selling foodstuffs at the market. It was tough at first, but with determination she slowly built something stable. One evening, as they sat together eating a simple meal, Mirabelle looked around the table. They didn't have luxury anymore. But they had peace. And that was enough. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. Life was no longer as flashy as before, but for the first time in a long time, Mirabelle, Fortune, and Blessing felt something different. Peace. No more sleepless nights filled with regret. No more fear of who or what they might encounter. No more pretending to be happy when deep down they were empty. They were finally free. Their mother, Mrs. James, worked hard at her foodstuff business. She woke up early, went to the market, and sold from morning till evening. It wasn't easy, but she poured her heart into it. She was determined to make things right. One afternoon, Auntie Grace stopped by to check on them. She smiled when she saw how different the house felt. "There is a light in this home again," she said, nodding. "I am proud of you all." Mrs. James wiped a tear from her eye. "I was blind, Grace. I let my selfishness control me. I almost lost my daughters forever." "But you didn't," Auntie Grace said, holding her hand. "And now you have a second chance. Don't waste it." One day, Mirabelle was walking home from work when she saw a familiar figure across the street. It was one of the girls she used to work with, the same life she had left behind. The girl Peace looked different. She was tired, her eyes dull, her body too thin. Mirabelle hesitated, then crossed the road. "Peace," she called. The girl turned, surprised. "Mirabelle? I thought you left town." "I left that life," Mirabelle said softly. Peace laughed bitterly. "Lucky you. Some of us don't have a choice." "There's always a choice," Mirabelle said. "It may not be easy, but there's always another way." Peace looked down, kicking a small stone on the ground. "I don't even know where to start." Mirabelle thought for a moment. Then she said, "Come home with me. Rest. We'll talk." Peace hesitated, then nodded. That evening, Peace sat with Mirabelle, Fortune, and Blessing at their small dining table, eating a simple meal. She listened as they told her about their struggles, how they almost lost their lives, and how they decided never to go back. Tears ran down Peace's face. "I want to leave too." Mrs. James reached out and held her hand. "Then we will help you." Peace wasn't the last girl they helped. One by one, others came seeking a way out. Some wanted to learn a skill. Some just needed a safe place to start over. The small home that once carried shame and regret became a place of healing. Mrs. James used her growing business to support the girls. Auntie Grace connected them with training centers. And Mirabelle, Fortune, and Blessing shared their story, warning others about the dangers they once ignored. With time, the pain of the past became a lesson, and the lesson became a mission. They were no longer victims. They were survivors. And they would spend the rest of their lives helping others find their way back to the light. As time passed, Mirabelle, Fortune, and Blessing adjusted to their new life. They no longer had expensive clothes, fancy apartments, or the luxury they once enjoyed. But every night when they laid their heads down to sleep, they felt something far greater: peace of mind. Their mother, Mrs. James, worked tirelessly at her foodstuff business, slowly earning the respect of the local market women. She no longer cared about what people thought of her. Instead, she focused on making an honest living and being a better mother. One evening, after closing her stall at the market, she overheard two women gossiping nearby. "Is that not Mrs. James? The same woman who pushed her daughters into prostitution?" "Yes, oh. See how she is selling foodstuff like a common trader." Life humbled her. Mrs. James heard every word, and for a moment shame threatened to rise in her chest. But then she took a deep breath and walked past them with her head held high. She had made mistakes, but she was no longer that woman. She was rebuilding her life, and nothing would stop her. One afternoon, Mirabelle sat outside their small house, deep in thought. The events of the past still haunted her. The night they were taken. The terror of being tied up, waiting for death. The moment they ran for their lives. "Thinking again?" Fortune's voice broke through her thoughts. Mirabelle nodded. "I just wonder, if we had never escaped, what would have happened? Would Mama even know what she had done?" Fortune sighed and sat beside her. "I used to ask myself that too. But thinking about it won't change anything. We are alive, Mirabelle. That's what matters." Blessing joined them, carrying 3 cups of cold water. "Do you think we'll ever be completely free from our past?" she asked. Mirabelle took a sip, then smiled. "Maybe not. But we can use it to help others." The sisters knew that healing wouldn't happen overnight. They still had nightmares sometimes. They still struggled with guilt and shame. But they were determined to rise above their past. Mirabelle's encounter with peace changed something inside her. She realized that there were many girls out there, just like them, who needed a way out. One by one, they started helping young women who wanted to escape the streets. At first, they didn't have much to offer. Just a listening ear, a warm meal, and a safe space. But as word spread, more girls came seeking help. Auntie Grace, seeing their efforts, decided to get involved. She helped them reach out to churches, NGOs, and local businesses that could provide job training. Mrs. James, using the money from her growing foodstuff business, started a small savings group to help these girls start over. It was slow at first, but soon they saw real change. One girl, Tenny, learned how to bake and started selling pastries. Another, Amaka, found a job as a cleaner in a hotel. A third girl, Zainab, went back to school. Each success story fueled their determination. One evening as they sat together, Mirabelle turned to her sisters and smiled. "We used to sell our bodies for money," she said. "Now we are saving lives." Fortune laughed. "Life is funny, isn't it?" Blessing nodded. "Yes. But I wouldn't change this for anything." One day while at the market, Mirabelle heard someone calling her name. She turned and saw a woman walking toward her. The moment she recognized the face, her heart nearly stopped. It was Linda, her closest friend from her old life. Linda looked different. Her makeup was heavy, her dress was flashy, but her eyes were filled with sadness. "Mirabelle." Linda whispered. "Is it really you?" Mirabelle swallowed hard. She hadn't seen Linda since the night they were kidnapped. "Yes, it's me." Linda looked her up and down. "You look different. So simple. So happier." Mirabelle finished for her. Linda sighed. "I don't know how to leave, Mirabelle. I feel trapped. I try to stop, but the moment I do, I remember the debt I owe the people who depend on me. I don't know any other way to survive." Mirabelle's heart ached for her. She knew that feeling all too well. "There's always another way," she said gently. "Come with me." Linda hesitated. "What if I fail?" "Then we'll pick you up again," Mirabelle said. "Just like my sisters picked me up." For the first time in years, Linda allowed herself to hope. Months later, the small initiative they started had grown into a full organization. More women joined them, sharing their own testimonies and helping others leave the streets. Their house became a place of refuge, a shelter for those who wanted to escape the darkness. Mrs. James, now respected in the community, became an advocate for women, warning mothers never to make the same mistakes she did. One day as Mirabelle stood in front of a group of young girls, telling her story, she felt something deep inside her, a sense of purpose she had never felt before. Her past didn't define her. Her mistakes didn't control her. She was free. And she would spend the rest of her life helping others find their own freedom. Life had come full circle. The girls who were once lost, broken, and trapped in darkness had now become a light for others. They had faced death and survived. They had been consumed by shame and overcome it. They had nearly lost each other but found their way back. And now they had a future filled with hope, redemption, and purpose. Because no matter how deep the darkness is, there is always a way back to the light. Years later, Mirabelle, Fortune, and Blessing looked back at their journey with gratitude. What once seemed like an endless nightmare had turned into a mission of hope. Their shelter had expanded, rescuing and rehabilitating hundreds of girls. Linda, once lost in darkness, had become a mentor to others. Their mother, Mrs. James, had transformed into a symbol of redemption. One evening as they sat watching the sunset, Mirabelle whispered, "We made it." Fortune smiled. "And we're just getting started." Their past was painful, but their future was bright. Because hope is stronger than despair.